We're delighted to celebrate Charmaine Craig's Miss Burma. I don't know if any of you have read it, but it's a really layered, beautiful story where the personal and the public intersect. Laila Lalami, the Pulitzer Finalist, calls the book a sweeping novel of Burma and its complicated history, told from the perspective of people whose voices have been systematically erased from the record. And while this is true, it doesn't capture the kind of intricate style of the book, how it jumps between personal and public, different spans of history, different subject positions, and identities, different time frames. As Amanata Forna writes, this is a book that explores how we're all actors in our histories and the histories of our nations. Let's give Charmaine a hand.
Hopefully I won't fall backwards during this. Thank you for that. And it's really wonderful to be here. There's some very close and dear old friends here, and in particular, someone, Peter Blackstock, to whom I owe so much, and I'm so glad that you're here, Peter. He's my editor and made a huge difference with this book. I thought that I would give you a little bit of an introduction to the novel before reading, just for a short period of time. This book has its roots in my mother's story, and it's really quite an epic story. She was Miss Burma, the first beauty queen in Burma, and something she was really embarrassed about, actually. For a time, she was the most famous actress in Burma. And she became a woman warrior when her first husband, who was the leader of a resistance army, was assassinated during peace talks with the military junta, and she made the decision to assume leadership of his troops. I grew up here, and the mother that I knew was very modest. Some of you here knew my mother. She didn't seek out the limelight. There were times when she would call herself a pacifist. And I think that if I were going to describe anything about her, I would say that spiritual beauty was the thing that was most important to her. So I knew when I made the decision to begin to write this book that I would need to grapple with some of those contradictions between the mother I knew and the persona, the legendary mother. And as I proceeded to work on the book, it became more and more clear to me that I also would need to grapple with some of Burma's contradictions. It's a beautiful country in terms of the rich diversity of its peoples. It's a country that is sort of lavishly beautiful in terms of its landscape and its built environment, but it's also, for a long time, for decades, until very recently, was called the most repressive regime in the world, or one of them. And right now, even as it stands at the cusp of democracy, we're hearing quite a bit about how it's also a country that is guilty of ethnic cleansing. So as I was thinking about these contradictions of Burma, I was pondering exactly what you said, Ken, the intersection between the political, the historical, and the personal. And I realized that I would need to include in this story the narrative of my grandparents. They had equally dramatic lives. They were both born in Burma, but they were both born minorities in Burma. Burma is made up of about 50 to 60% of ethnic Burmans, depending on who you talk to. Some people put the number a little higher, some lower. And the rest of the population is made up of there are hundreds of different ethnic groups. My grandfather, who was born in Rangoon, was Jewish, born in the 1920s into a robust Jewish community. And he was orphaned at an early age and sent to Calcutta to be raised by his maternal aunties. And when he returned in the late 1930s, the era of colonialism was really drawing to a close in Burma. He was a romantic, and for a short period of time, he worked as a customs officer in the British system. And when he was at the seaport of Akyab, he was standing near the jetty, and at the end of the jetty, there was a woman with hair down to her ankles. And he immediately fell in love and determined that he wanted to, very impetuously determined he wanted to marry her, though he knew nothing about her. And it turned out that she was of the Karen ethnic minority group. The Karens are one of Burma's indigenous peoples. one of its larger ethnic minority groups. And for centuries before the British began to annex the territories that became modern Burma, the Karens were enslaved by the ethnic Burmans. So they're a long persecuted people. And my grandmother, her name was Kin, she spoke Karen and Burmese. And my grandfather, whose name was Benny, spoke really only English after having been away from Burma for so long. Nevertheless, they married. And apparently it was a tempestuous, passionate relationship from the beginning. And soon they had my mother, Louisa, and the Japanese were invading during World War II. Because the Burmans had led the Japanese into the country under the rallying cry, Burma for the Burmans, because they wanted Burma to be returned, well, not only liberated from the British, but in some ways returned to the status where the Burmans had really leadership of the country. Both of my grandparents were targets, my grandfather having been a British officer and looking Anglo, and my grandmother being Karen. So they fled, along with hundreds of thousands of others. And it was the beginning, really, of a very dramatic journey for them. My grandfather was twice captured and twice tortured and twice saved by the Karens. And he was so touched by their loyalty, not only to him, but to the British, for whom they fought. And he was so affected by what he saw in the way of persecution, not just during the war, but after the war, when the Burmans were given leadership of the country by the British, and the persecution of the Karen peoples resumed, that though he became a very successful businessman on the heels of the war, he decided to devote himself to the Karen cause. And he spent some time trying to help them in peaceful ways. And when that didn't work, he was one of the architects of the Karen Revolution, which became the longest-running civil war in recorded history. The outbreak of that revolution was in 1949, and my grandfather was soon disappeared. And my grandmother took their then 4 children to the jungle, where they hid and were sort of always on the run for 3 years, never knowing if my grandfather was alive or dead. And my grandmother doing everything she could to keep the family together, trading in peanut oil and rolled cigarettes, and seeking comfort in the consolation of other men. That's sort of just the beginning of the story. So as you see, I inherited in some ways a very obviously dramatic story. However, as a novelist and as a literary writer, really I didn't inherit and I didn't have access to what was really important to me, the spiritual realm, the psychological, the emotional realm. How any of this was personally meaningful to these individuals. For example, just to give you an example of the kind of question that I was asking myself, I wondered what was it like for these 2 people, these characters based on my grandparents, Benny and Kin, to come together again after 3 years of being apart, when they both endured a lot, but also grown and experienced some beautiful things apart. What was it like to come together again and make a go of marriage after that? What was it like for my mother at the height of her fame in the late 50s, early 60s, to become the rumored mistress of the military dictator, a man whom she despised? What was it like for her then to make the decision to marry the Karen resistance leader whom I mentioned before, a man who had a bullet lodged in his skull and illegitimate children scattered across the country, and who had, when she met him, made the decision to put down his arms in order to pursue a pan-ethnic, pro-democratic understanding with that same military dictator. So I had these questions about sort of the emotional, but I also needed to understand for myself what was deeply afflicting each of these characters, and how what was hurting them personally, individually, sort of pushed them to exert their own kind of pressure on the historical, on the political. Also, I wasn't particularly interested in sort of just pursuing sort of the expected, in my treatment of such things as, let's say, my mother being a beauty queen. That had no, my mother was a beauty queen, so I needed to figure out for myself not only what the national and political significance of that event was, but also if there was anything particularly ennobling about that for my mother and her family, or particularly damaging. Same with this whole idea of my grandfather being involved in the revolution. It's dramatic, but I needed to find a way to understand what personally that meant to him and how he would have found meaning in the deeper sense, even the spiritual sense, through an action like that. And the last thing I'll just say is that through this process, I've become that much more, very, very sensitive to what I can only call a sort of generational significance. I've thought a lot about how different family members began an action that I'm sure they thought the end point would come soon. And it was really only in light of their descendants' actions that what they began gained a new meaning. Even now, as I'm beginning to share the book, it feels as if my mother and her family members are sort of flowering all over again in a different way. And that kind of generational significance was also something I wanted to try to bring out in the book. I spent 2 years interviewing my mother before she died in 2010. I'm so glad I did that. It was a richly rewarding experience, but it was also a frustrating one because though my mother was able to talk about all of the events and some of the sort of vivid details that found their way into the book, she wasn't good at looking inward or backward. And I realized that was really how she survived everything. And I had a similarly rewarding and frustrating experience when researching the book and looking at scholarly literature, where I discovered that there was an incredible absence of information about the ethnic nationalities in Burma. There's some of that there, but it really made sense to me when I learned that the Karen people, for example, during their period of enslavement, had their hands cut off if they were found with writing implements, such that they lost their whole written language and their historical texts. And I came across little tidbits in some of the stories that I heard from my mother and from some of the other people that I interviewed that let me understand that there was an American presence, that America and the United States had a role in this story as well that hadn't ever been written about, either in the scholarly literature that was published up until a couple of years ago at least. This is all to say that what began as a very personal story of my mother became a much bigger story of not only a family, a marriage, but and a people and a nation, but even to an extent of the United States too. So I wanted to read just one scene, and the reason I'm choosing this scene is because it's one of those scenes that has sort of obvious dramatic import, and yet I had to do a lot of work to try to pull out significance, the kind of significances that I just mentioned, the personal, the marital, or relational, the historical, the political, and the spiritual. And let's see, it takes place, it's on the bottom of page 225. I'm just mentioning this because I've gotten feedback that some people like to follow along. So in case you are one of those, and I'll just set it up a tiny bit. This is about 2/3 of the way into the book. Benny and Kin, who, as I just mentioned, were separated for a period of time, have been together again. They started living together again in a suburb near Rangoon in 1951. Benny was soon thrown into house arrest, and so they have been living under the same roof, in a way, prisoners under the same roof, for 3.5 years at this point. What was already a difficult marriage, or a challenging one in some ways, before their separation, has become one that is marked by deep resentment, and that tension between them, the resentment between them, has only been inflamed very recently when Kin has embarked on really a campaign to make their daughter into a serious contender for the Miss Burma title. She's doing this on the one hand for political reasons, but really she's doing it also for very personal ones, including, I think, her feeling that of being effaced as a woman. Benny is horrified by what she's doing, and just as horrified by Louisa's apparent stoicism in the face of her mother's plans. So this morning, Kin and Louisa have gone to the stadium where the pageant will take place, and Benny has been now it's evening almost, and Benny has been picked up by a soldier, and he's being escorted it's the first time he would have left his home in years, escorted to the stadium by the soldier in a truck. Evening was falling by the time they approached the central railway station. Already a crowd was coming over the road leading to the stadium that had been named for Burma's liberator and protector of the populace, Aung San. Looking out his window at the commotion, Benny had the strange impression of taking in alternately a collection of individuals, a mother tugging at the hand of a young child, a delicate man hawking snacks, a police officer sectioning off a side street, a legless girl being wheeled along by a dog, and a collective force. The urgency and excitement in the air were undeniable, and in spite of his own cynicism, and in spite of the armed soldiers patrolling the road up ahead, Benny felt the tug of elation. It was breathtaking, the vision of this panoply of peoples, young and old, able-bodied and destitute, blameless and criminal, all taking possession of the streets. It was also irrational and oddly undemocratic, this impulse of thousands to catch a glimpse of whoever was crowned. The poorest among them wouldn't possibly be able to pay for even the cheapest tickets. But there was nothing rational or democratic about beauty itself, Benny told himself. And still, beauty was not classist or racist. From the looks of it, these people were prepared to adore whichever girl of whichever origins became their queen. Perhaps beauty alone had the power to transfigure people so. And yet, Benny reminded himself with a shudder, there was something insidious about beautifying the country's image by means of a girl, whatever her background, for somewhere in the darkness beyond the Delta, innocent people continued to be shot and killed. Half a block from the stadium, the truck came to a stop beside a jeep, where two soldiers were waiting to escort Benny through the overspill of would-be spectators surging from the station. The narrowing evening was giving way to a deeper darkness, heightening the assault of sights and sounds and smells on Benny's desensitized soul. Soon he was marshaled past a throng of beggars being rebuffed by a guard, through a stadium gate, into a tunnel, and out into an arena where, in the shadows of an enormous stage that had been erected, he discovered Kin, seated in a lower section of the packed stands. She claimed him with a look of relief as he stumbled toward her along the narrow aisle, and he was overcome by a feeling of belonging, of being bound to her by years of experience. How easily he'd forgotten the powerful pleasure she'd so willingly given him, the sensual offering of loyalty and children. Intoxicating, not just their early years, but all the years until his imprisonment. Years when they had given themselves over to the lives they'd remade in order to be together. Now, approaching her, he seemed to see every one of their children's faces in her own still lovely one. And when he sat on the hard bench between her and a heavy-set man, and she leaned in to say something in his ear, he was immediately comforted by the familiar sound of her voice and by the clean scent she was wearing, undercut by her own almost undetectable deeper fragrance. That feeling of renewed appreciation for his wife, of closeness with her, only grew when at last the stadium lights went dim, and a hush came over the assembled thousands, and sweet music began to sound over the loudspeaker. It wasn't long before yellow floodlights shot up from the stage, and then a procession of bathing costumed girls appeared before them. Many of these girls, he saw with a pang of sympathy, were too heavily made up. Most wore smiles that were too theatrical. Some tottered and swung their hips as though to impersonate feminine confidence and magnetism. Others cast defeated glances at the audience, or blinked out at the darkness as if to find reassurance there. And Louisa emerged, in a simple white suit, and it was as if a switch were thrown. And was some amplification of lighting responsible for her skin appearing so luminous? Her smile seemed to reach out past him and across the stadium, to reach out as if to fling the gates open and let everyone in. Who was this creature? He was still asking himself a quarter hour later, when Louisa was invited to present herself uniquely to the judges. Who had taught her to move on those gold heels, not cheaply or brashly, not frantically? No, there wasn't a tense or unnatural note in the way she fell into a smile, cast her eyes over the stands, turned, looked with another unabashed glance back at the audience. Here, rather, was a young woman radiant with self-possession. Yes, this was precisely what distinguished her from the rest. Not the mechanics of her beauty, the way her eyes were set above the sculpture of her cheekbones, or the voluptuousness that Benny preferred not to notice. All of these girls were knockouts, mechanically speaking. Rather, what distinguished her was what she did with her looks, disregarded them, so that the outer luminosity gave way to a more resplendent inner one. Wasn't it a truism that a virtue was a virtue only by dint of its keeper's unconsciousness of it? And didn't she seem to be unself-consciousness made manifest? A sort of heavenly body obediently prepared to shine on for the others, spinning and circling around her composure, until the light of that composure must finally perish. I give you my light, she seemed to communicate, that you might have a measure of grace. I give you my naturalness, that you might see a simpler, more natural life, one unspotted by the shadows of divisiveness. Yes, I have the blood of various peoples coursing through my veins, but what of it? We are all various. Don't despair. Stop these arguments. Content yourself with enchantment.
That was very lovely. Next we have Maaza Mengiste, who will read from her book, Beneath the Lion's Gaze, which narrates the Ethiopian Civil War through two characters. One, the Emperor Haile Selassie, depicted in the last days of the revolution, and Haile, a respected doctor, who must protect his family from violence, but is also asked by the regime to treat a tortured political prisoner. The book was named one of the top 10 best contemporary African books by The Guardian, and the New York Times said, Mengiste joins a group of other young Africans writing in English, whose subject is the continent's post-colonial wars. They are unafraid of depicting the vicious violence Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth are capable of, and showing how Fanon's colonially oppressed grew into master oppressors themselves. She's a contributor to The New Yorker and Granta, and named a new literary idol by New York Magazine. And she's also the writer for the documentary Girls Rising, which featured the voices of people like Meryl Streep and Kate Blanchett. Let's give her a hand.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. I am really excited about the conversation that will follow my very brief reading with Charmaine. I absolutely loved the book, so I'm glad you guys got a chance to hear her read, and I hope you buy her book at the end. I'm going to read a section of my novel that deals with the emperor. Okay, I'll give you a brief overview. He is, this is the very early days of the revolution, and he is trying to figure out, how did this happen? I think this is a question we're asking ourselves today. But how did these people get into power? So let me just start from there. He'd been confused by how many they were. These men in dark green fatigues who now cradled his elbow in palace meetings and whispered that he must remember their demands. He must remember his people. He no longer knew their numbers, did not know which of these earnest soldiers had taken control of his radio station and breathed these words into every home in his city. We do not believe in an eye for an eye. We will bring to trial all those who misuse their power. There can be justice without bloodshed. And was it only the wind? Or had his people sent joyous shouts into the night sky? In the whirl and speed of so much happening so fast, the bodies of these men had disintegrated into mere voices in his ear. They seemed molded out of the shadows that clung to dark corners of his palace, drifting in and out of his line of vision, leaving traces of smoke and the scent of burning wood in their wake. They talked to him in his sleep, their words nestling against his head and burrowing into his brain. The emperor slid through his days, shaking the noises loose from his ears, trying to bat the prodding requests away. Let us help you lead the country. You are old and we are young. You are one, we are many. We will do everything you ask. The pressure built inside Emperor Haile Selassie's head, drilling behind his ears, behind his eyes. Thoughts collapsed into 100 scattered words, floating in front of his face, pinned onto pages that were shoved under his pen. He found himself numbed by the honeyed smiles that sliced his resistance more than their hard, sharp eyes. Your name here, and here, these officers he'd never known before said, sign this and dissolve your ministry and the Crown Council. We have a new and better way for you to rule. They were mere men instructing God's chosen, the monarch with blood that could be traced to wise King Solomon of the Bible. Soon the voices floated from the radio and called his best men to submit to the wishes of all and go to jail. There will be no bloodshed, the radio said, only justice. His senators and judges, cabinet members and ministers, his noblemen began to leave their posts and walk with grim confidence to turn themselves in. Sign here and here, no time to read. We must hurry, trust us, don't sit, there is no rest. We must show that change is coming. Don't you hear your people? The emperor stood. The emperor walked. The emperor followed the backs of the uniformed men from one meeting into another. What has become of us, he asked himself. When will angels lead us out of this fray? Emperor Haile Selassie tried his best to become immobile, to stand rigid without following, to sit without signing, to watch without nodding, without expression, without revealing the panic that fluttered through him. But things kept moving forward. We must not be anything other than what we are, he reminded himself. We are, and so we will be. We are here in these days of locusts and noise, but it has been written that this shall pass, and so it will.
We're now shifting to the Oprah's Book Club portion of the evening, and I'd like to welcome our two brilliant writers on stage. And you yourselves should think of questions for our audience participation section that we call Q&A. We're going to have a mic that'll go around, so when it comes to that point, if you could wait until the mic reaches you before the question, since this is going out on the worldwide intertubes. Okay. Welcome.
Hello, I'm Oprah. Sorry. I have to tell you about my experience with reading Charmaine's absolutely lovely book. Was this sense that I recognized so much of this history. War is in some ways a unifying language across the world. And just looking at what happened in Burma, I mean, your story, we'll talk about the research a little bit more, but it was so well researched. You know, one of the things I had always felt about writing Beneath the Lion's Gaze was that I was exploring a human story as opposed to maybe a story about conflict. And this book, your book, really brought that home, that we are in essence talking about each other when we are writing these stories. We are exploring not only what maybe some of the Burmese or the Karen did, but what human beings do in these kinds of situations. And I found it beautifully done, and in language that is vivid and poetic, lyrical, and also very precise. Well done with that. I think one of the first questions I wanted to ask you had to do with what you were mentioning in your introduction of speaking to your mother in the 2 years before she passed away, trying to get this history. What was that like? How did you go about finding those pockets of silence when she may not have revealed things and maybe you didn't know she wasn't revealing something at that moment? Or did you understand that there were secrets or things she didn't want to say and you would have to find out after you spoke to her about some of that history? How did that go about? How did those conversations happen?
That's a wonderful question, and I don't have an easy answer because it was such an intuitive process, interviewing my mother. One thing that was interesting about the process is that she was most comfortable about and most eager to talk about her childhood, which was interesting to me because it was such a painful one in many ways. She was twice a refugee in her childhood, both during the Second World War and then the first several years of the Civil War. And yet it was an early lesson for me in sort of that wonderful paradox that can come out of some of the bleakest periods. And so when she spoke about those periods, though tears would come to her eyes quite often and she would have to stop talking. That was when I sort of gained the most in the way of visceral detail. The later periods of her life were much more difficult for her to talk about. And I think the difference is she had much more agency as later on. Whereas as a child, she really was, sort of pulled along by fate. And so talking about what happened during the Miss Burma period, all the rumors, and some of the decisions that she made was just so painful and difficult that was the whole area that I had to do more pushing and more sort of talking to other people and even putting the pieces together politically through scholarly research. Were you able to find, your mother was quite prominent in Burma as a result of the pageant, but also I'm assuming because your grandfather was well known also in the community. Were you able to find documentation about them through archives or through documents, or did you have to rely on word of mouth and family stories? All of the above, really. I had grown up really knowing the legend of my mother, not only because my father was a storyteller and he was American, but he was a Don Quixote type figure, and still is, and really loved to tell these sort of oversized tales of my mother. But those were actually echoed when I would meet other Burmese dissidents or people in this country from Burma, and they would speak about her and stories they had told. One of the things that I kept coming across when I was doing scholarly literature that would mention my mother, for example, even in the stacks at the university where I teach, is she was Miss Burma and the rumored mistress of the dictator, and or even sometimes and the mistress of the dictator, and became a revolutionary, perhaps. But that was sort of the extent of it. But one thing I would just want to mention is that my parents had done something. I talk about generational. I was talking earlier about generational significance, and my parents had done something really interesting when I was young, and I still vividly remember it. I was 7, and they hired a writer to take down my grandfather's story because they knew that it was such a kind of potent story, and they wanted to preserve it. And so I remember seeing these conversations between my grandfather and this writer, and he only got so far before he said he couldn't talk about it anymore. It was too painful. Wow. But that was a very meaningful resource for me.
So you were able to, did you have recordings? Were they the handwritten?
She had then gone ahead and turned it into the beginning of a book. I mean, it wasn't very good, but at least I had a sense of what had happened.
Right.
And my mother herself, I should say, had tried her own hand at writing this. And had, over many years, in fact, tried to write her story. Wow. And it only yielded maybe 25 pages, but that was something that I looked at a lot.
It's fascinating. I wondered if the book, as you mentioned, spans generations. It goes through several decades of our characters' lives. It sounds to me like, you know, your inspiration was your mother's story, but then you decided to go backwards and kind of capture the story of your grandparents as well. I'd like to talk a little bit about that decision. Was that one of the ways you felt you could, that's one of the only ways you might be able to capture your mother's story, was by going as far back as her parents?
So, there was another version of the book, and that didn't include my grandparents, and really in which the history of Burma and the political situation in Burma was very much in the background. The reason that I started with that story, and it was a story that began in 2010 and was narrated by an older woman, very much modeled on my mother, and sort of like a monologue to her daughter, very much modeled on myself. The reason that I wanted to do that is because I've noticed that when there is too much historical event, and maybe you've experienced this, a political event, not too much, when there is a presence of historical and political event in a novel, it's easy for the novel to be only considered in light of its subject, not in terms of its literary merit. And in a kind of adolescent way, perhaps, I wanted to dodge that bullet and just write a literary novel and sort of keep the event really very much in the background and forefront the relational, the emotional, psychological. The problem was, and I wrote two complete drafts of that book. The problem was that to the few people I showed it to, it was all too clear that that I was sort of skirting around something very important, which is the Karen people, their story, and the story of Burma.
Right.
And it was impossible to divine how my mother's story was meaningful or significant in a national sense, and even in a personal sense, without drawing in all of that. So that was when I sort of shoved aside my own ego and self and made the decision to tell a multi-perspectival novel that began with my grandfather returning to Burma, really. And because I knew that if I did that, I could take us from the colonial period through the Second World War into the Civil War. And so it was really a process of getting myself out of the way.
Yeah. It's what the book, another thing the book does so well is really we move into the intimate lives of each of these characters. The political is personal. The personal becomes political, but we also see a marriage that's fraying, and we see Benny's frustrations with kin and their inability to talk to each other, even to apologize when they know that they want to or they should. How that seems in some ways to involve a kind of reimagining of family. That can you talk a little bit about that? Did you know your grandparents in any particular sense growing up, and then what was it like to begin to write about this marriage and things that they were both, I don't know, the narrator in getting us into each of these characters' lives kind of usurped the reader's judgment. We understood every single decision that they made, or at least I understood every decision, even though someone else may not agree with it, even though they were hurting each other. What was that like to write about that about your family?
You had asked how much I knew my
Yeah.
grandparents. My grandmother passed away before I was born. My grandfather I knew very well, and he didn't pass away until I was in my 20s. That said, while I had a rule for myself that all the history and politics had to be as accurate as I could possibly make it, and while I wanted to tell, have all of the events be as close to what actually happened to my family as possible, while taking sort of novelistic license, compressing characters and events and such. In fact, when it came, I knew that my grandparents had had a difficult, strained marriage. But I also knew that my grandfather spoke of my grandmother in the most, sort of like my father, in the most of my mother, completely idealizing, loving terms. So to finish what I was saying before, while I had this rule about getting certain things right, on the other hand, as a literary writer, it was more important to me to kind of do what you were mentioning before, Maaza, which is get at the human truth rather than the truth of my grandparents, let's say. And because misunderstandings, the tension between loyalty and disloyalty and so on were so important to me as I was writing this book, as I was evoking the scenes, what was centrally significant to me was getting at the way in which we can have so many feelings that are in contention with each other and so many perceptions that are in contention with one another. And I think because language and misunderstandings and identity was such a part of the book anyway, it made sense to bring out in their relationship that brew of feelings that often, you know, sort of are clashing against one another in any moment. So he might be feeling sorry and angry and you know, ashamed at the same time.
Right, and that came through really well. I have many questions, but I'm going to ask one more, and then I'll turn it over to all of you. But I was really fascinated by this idea of beauty in the book, and it came from also a section that you had read here when Louisa is at the pageant. But could you talk a little bit about that? Just reading this book, going through the scenes about the beauty pageant, living in today's America, I have to say it. In some ways being, I feel like we are now bombarded by glitz and glitter, gaudiness, the beauty that tends to parade across the stages. Beauty is very political. It's become that, it always has been. But in some ways it's a numbing thing. It's supposed to stun us into paralysis or you know, silence us when we stand in front of it. And yet you've created with Louisa somebody that is doing her best to try to subvert that or find her way within what beauty means, or, you know, in this Miss Burma pageant, and as someone who was part Karen. Could you maybe talk a little bit more about that, some of the ideas that you were working with in the book with her?
Sure. I mean, you've already said it very well, I think, that, you know, there's my mother being Miss Burma was something I was sort of embarrassed about, is the truth of it. And even though it was something that I knew made her a legend in her country. And so to write about that and to find a way not to sort of subvert, as you said, or flip it, was really important to me. And another way that what I had to do is really think about, well, what made my mother beautiful for me? And it was her self-possession. It was her disregard for any of that. And a generosity of spirit that was truly just sort of, she just unthinkingly wanted to open herself to others. So that was part of it. But the other side of it, which was more menacing, I think, was how crowning a minority, Miss Burma, was a political and kind of problematic act on the part of the narrative. I mean, of the country. So she is, the token now, and a representative that everything is fine. There's no racism in the country if Miss Burma can be Karen.
Right.
And there has been this long campaign of what's called Burmanization in Burma, where there's this aggressive attempt to force integration upon the minority peoples. And so I wanted to consider that moment of her being crowned, as part of that kind of aggressive act.
Yeah, that was wonderful. Thank you. Now there's a mic that will be passed around, that's coming around, so any questions?
Hi, I've already read the novel. It's fabulous and beautifully written, and I urge everyone to buy it. My question for you is, do you think that your mother won Miss Burma pageant because, was it partly political, or simply that she was the most beautiful woman in the pageant? Do you have any sense of that?
Well, I have no idea, but my hunch is that it probably was political, because her father was a known, as Maaza mentioned, he was a known political prisoner at the time. He was known to have been very involved in the Karen Revolution. And so I can't see how her being crowned Miss Burma wasn't sort of an attempt to say, everything's fine now, we're good.
And just one other question, if I may. Was your father of British ancestry?
My father, who's American.
Your grandfather.
Or my grandfather. He, no, in fact, so he was born in Rangoon, a Sephardic Jew. His relatives had come some of them had come from Spain and Portugal during the Inquisition, some through Kurdistan, and others directly to India. So most of I think there are 13 generations of rabbis going back, many in Cochin, some in Calcutta, and others in Rangoon.
Thank you.
How did your mother feel knowing you were writing this book?
She knew for a long time that I wanted to tell the story. She had been approached by other people, journalists, some documentary filmmakers, some screenwriters who wanted to tell this story, and I had each time had a minor temper tantrum and said, in a very polite way, no, please, just let me do it. And so she kept it for me. But she made clear to me, and she said it very simply, she said, do whatever you want with it, fictionalize it, tell it exactly as I told you, or don't do it. You don't have to do this, Charmaine. Because she saw that I was really struggling with it for a while, and it wasn't coming easily. And I think she thought it was sort of a burden that I had been carrying around for a long time. That said, I am pretty sure she would have been actually very happy with it. Yeah.
Just to ask about the political side, I was wondering if how the book has been received, if it has been yet, if it isn't too early, in Burma itself. The themes are still very relevant, obviously. Yeah.
I think it's still a little bit early to know, but that said, I've been sort of overwhelmed with how many emails I've been getting from people in the Burmese community in this country and in Burma. A lot of messages, a lot of interest. People are so excited about it. And there have been some inquiries from some publishers, I think, in Burma. But I've experienced my first sting of a backlash recently with someone saying some really nasty lies about racist, sexist lies about my mother, which, hurt me more than it should have. I should have, and it just reminded me this is exactly what she went through when she was young. And of course that's going to happen again. And I expect there will be more of that, probably.
Hi, so your grandfather and I suppose your aunts and uncles, they came to the United States, but not with your grandmother, and they came as refugees, and I was wondering about their experience once they were here.
Yeah, my grandfather came here. My grandmother at first refused to come to this country because she was so sensitive to racism in Burma, being a minority in Burma, and she had heard that people who weren't white in this country were treated terribly, and she was terrified of coming here. And so my grandfather, in fact, got papers for both him and her and 2 of their children to go to the United States, and she refused to go with him. And regretted her decision when she was promptly attacked in her own home by Burman soldiers. But it was a humbling experience. My grandfather got a position selling sewing machines in Sears. And he had been, a very successful businessman. And when my grandmother actually I'll tell you a story about, one story first. When my father came, my American father, he had known the family, came and visited my grandfather. My mother was still in Burma. He was appalled because my grandfather, who they'd had servants in Burma and so forth, he was feeding the children ice cream for breakfast and hot dogs for breakfast. He didn't know how to take care of 2 little kids. And when my grandmother finally got here, she died soon thereafter, but she came to see him where he was working and saw him, giving a display of a sewing machine to another woman, and was really shaken. That said, my grandfather was the kind of person who, after everything he had lived through, he really never felt sorry for himself. And so, I think that he was primarily very grateful to be here.
Hi, we have a question from the live stream from Dalloway. He says, the Karen Revolution has continued to this very day. What would be or what might be the ultimate goal of the Karen Revolution that your mother had envisioned?
My mother, it was very, very important to her to arrive at a pan-ethnic understanding. She was, as far as I know, the first person to facilitate a pan-ethnic peace agreement way back in the early 90s, I think, or in the 90s. Maybe it was 1996. So I feel that her ultimate goal would be a country that supports mutual respect for all of Burma's peoples, and probably something with like a federal democracy, where there's an element of self-determination for each people, where they're allowed to teach their own language in schools in addition to Burmese, and practice their own religions, but at the same time participate shoulder to shoulder with the other ethnic groups in the government.
Hi. When you were interviewing your mom, what were the raciest things that came out that you didn't expect? Where you were like, oh my God, Mom, I didn't know I was going to hear that.
This is on live stream.
That you feel comfortable talking about now.
Yeah.
Particular about Naywin.
I think I have to jump. Do you want to kind of take that one while let's just say there was something, but I'm not going to say. It's not in the book even.
Maybe one more question, and then we will.
Hi, I was wondering if you could talk about how long you worked on the earlier drafts, when you were talking about from the different perspective, and then when making that transition to this novel we have here, did you find yourself going back to those old drafts and pulling in parts, or did you just completely scrap it and start anew? Just like talking about that transition from that earlier version to the version we have now.
I struggled initially with how to get the book started. It's my feeling that form is really the expression of all of our aims in a book. And so initially my aims were much narrower, as I mentioned, and the form was narrower. And so it took me less time to write that book. So after a couple of false starts, that book came over the process of maybe a year, and then I spent another year revising it before, going through what I mentioned before, realizing that it wasn't ultimately serving the story. I think that there's really only one scene from that whole novel that found its way into this book. And it's the scene, the earliest point in that novel was in 1963. And the novel, the latest point was 2010. And so the scene is a scene where Louisa's already the rumored mistress of the dictator, and very famous, and has sort of sequestered herself inside her home. And this Karen warrior, whom she's met in her childhood, shows up and ends up asking her to marry him. That was the only scene in the first version of the book.
All right, so that closes out our evening. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. And
thank you, Charmaine. That was wonderful.
Just a reminder that we have food in the back as well as books for sale, so please buy a book, grab some Burmese.